This is Biochemistry Unfolded, from atoms to algorithms, a weekly podcast on the topic of computational biochemistry and biophysics. So, welcome back to Biochemistry Unfolded, from atoms to algorithms. So in today's episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about what makes biochemistry the oldest branch of science on Earth. That's right. Why is biochemistry the oldest branch? Well, we've been using our biochemistry knowledge for about 13,000 years to make one popular fermented beverage, that's beer, as well as wine and spirits. So that dates back for thousands of years, and we've learned to harness the power of yeast to break down sugars for ethanol and CO2. Today, that has grown to a global market of about $851.15 billion in 2024. That's according to Fortune Business Insights. And it's expected to grow to about $1.2 trillion by 2032. So, it's grown quite a bit over the past thousands of years. Some of the factors in driving these global beer sales is going to be a rising demand in emerging economies around the world, as well as a growing middle class in many of these emerging economies. Also, there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions within the industry that drives growth, the popularity of craft beer, as well as the emergence of more independent breweries and the increasing demand for alcoholic beverages globally as well. And so the leading beer companies on Earth today, Anheuser-Busch InBev, Heineken, Kirin Holdings, and Asahi Group Holdings are some of the more common ones. So how do we make beer? You need 4 essential ingredients. You're going to need malted grains, such as cereal grains. Many of these come from barley. That provides the fermented sugars. You need hops, yeast, and of course you need water. Water is probably the more common ingredient. And so the first thing you're going to do is take your grains, and in the process of mashing, you're going to mash those grains, and that partially causes those grains to grow. It induces the embryo to start growing, and then you're going to add water. That puts them in the form of wort with water and heat. And then you cool your wort. You make, you're going to make that wort, you're going to add your yeast once it's cool. And then about 10 to 15 days later, you're going to have your fermented beverage, your fermented beer, right? So that's essentially how beer is made today. Now, let's go back about 13,000 years ago to a site in modern-day Israel. That's Rakafet. And so on this picture, this shows the location of Rakafet near Mount Carmel. And that is, they've discovered a site with fermented beverage and food storage in stone mortars in the Rakafet cave. And the archaeologists in this study from 2018 in the Journal of Archaeological Science, they found they were investigating the Tufian ritual feasting, and they found evidence of fermentation, evidence of beer in these stone mortars. And so that kind of said, hey, even 13,000 years ago, that's like 11,000 BC, we were fermenting beer in these caves. And throughout ancient Mesopotamia and Persia, we have also found similar evidence of fermentation vessels containing beer byproducts. So what are we looking for? What are archaeologists looking for in the case of when we're looking for beer in these ancient vessels? Well, what they're doing is they're actually looking for a chemical called calcium oxalate, and so that's CaC2O4. It's basically a calcium salt with a 2-carbon molecule with 2 carboxylic acids on it. The calcium oxalate is the conjugate base. This is also known as beer stone. And the salt crystals here, it forms kind of a brownish precipitate that accumulates in the vats and the barrels, causing from the fermentation of beer. It's also a common constituent of human kidney stones as well. So if you ever had a kidney stone, you know what these feel like, these crystals inside the body. They are quite hard, and they can be quite painful when you are getting rid of a kidney stone. So that's essentially what they're looking for when they're looking for evidence of fermentation and beer, right? If we go to ancient Mesopotamia, which I guess that would be ancient Sumeria, so a city, let's look at the city of Umma in southern Iraq. That would be modern day Iraq. That city is an ancient Sumerian city, and they found a lot of Sumerian documents that mention beer quite frequently. So they were quite interested in consuming this beverage, and specifically in the context of many temple supplies, as well as a vehicle of administering medicinal herbs. So they were actually using this medicinally in addition to recreationally. This picture shows a beer receipt from this time. It's kind of like if they found a receipt 2,000 years from today or so, they'd find a receipt from your local convenience store. Of course, the paper doesn't last as long as stone, but this receipt shows the purpose of best beer from a brewer in about 2050 BC in that southern city of Umma in Sumeria. And of course, the Sumerians were really big on beer. They actually had a goddess of beer. The goddess Ninkasi is the Sumerian goddess of beer and alcohol. She's the daughter of a king of Uruk, and her mother was a high priestess of the temple of Inanna. This particular statue depicts the goddess Ninkasi. And they also have found stone tablets back as far as 2000 BC with a poem that translates into English as a hymn to Ninkasa or Ninkasi. And so you can actually find the translations of this hymn to Ninkasi and several YouTube videos if you're interested in checking that out and exploring more information. So let's go from Sumeria in Mesopotamia all the way over to Egypt. And so we're going to cross the Sinai Peninsula, go about 800 miles or so, and in what is now modern day Egypt, and actually ancient Egypt, the Egyptians were very fond of beer and brewing. They've actually found evidence of consumption at literally all levels, from the peasants all the way up to the pharaohs. They found evidence of beer in vessels in the ancient pyramids, where the dead were often buried with supplies of beer because they felt this was so important they wanted to bring beer into the afterlife with them. And so I'm now thinking of the modern day equivalent of this with the Rogue Dead Guy Ale from the Rogue Brewery in Cleveland, Ohio. That's an excellent beer. So a little shout out to the folks up there. I love myself some Rogue Dead Guy Ale. Anyway, let's look at an ancient brewery in Egypt, and this clay sculpture depicts an ancient brewery with several ancient brewers. I guess these would be slaves, and the man standing, of course, was the overseer. And so the figures are seen in various stages of fermentation. You've got 9 figures that are sifting the grains. You've got 3 figures sieving mash, and then 3 or maybe 4 crouching before various ovens at the bottom of the figure. And so this was uncovered in a site in Egypt, Deir al-Bahri, and so they found evidence of that ancient brewery in Egypt. And so from Egypt, one other interesting thing about ancient Egypt, this is also the first evidence we find of antibiotics in beer. And so obviously it's a very common fermented beverage. In ancient Egyptian recipes, they found tetracycline in their beer, which is a modern day antibiotic. Of course, the ancient Egyptians did not know what tetracycline was, but as an antibiotic, this would help keep bacterial growth at bay. And so that helps to make the water a little bit more drinkable. And so there's evidence even today. We use a lot of preservatives, and hops is actually an antibacterial that helps keep the bacterial growth down, making the water even more drinkable as well. So let's cross the Mediterranean over to Northern Europe. And if we go to the Neolithic village of Skara Brae in the Orkney Islands, that's in modern day Scotland, in about 1500 to 2000 BC, this is some of the earliest evidence of brewing in this region of the world. And so this is in Scotland, and of course Scotland and England and Ireland, as well as Germany, Scandinavia, they were also very, very fond of fermented beverages. And so this led to the development of modern beer. And the modern brewing industry, we owe a lot of thanks to the monasteries of the Middle Ages, which is around the 5th to the 15th centuries. We have several monasteries throughout Europe, and they were known for that the monks and nuns were expected to live by their own labor and not accept charity. But the monasteries were also known as a safe haven for travelers in search of food and shelter. And so the nuns and the monks would brew beer and wine, and that was served in the monasteries as a source of finances to help support the monastery in their mission of providing those safe havens for travelers traveling. So that kind of gave rise, and they've got a lot of excellent brewing recipes from ales and lagers from this time as well. Now, if we go back to the first millennium to about the 9th century, prior to the 9th century, the use of hops was not really used in beer. They actually used what was called Gruit. And so Gruit ales were used. The Gruit was a bittering and flavoring agent that used various combinations of herbs, such as sweet gale, such as mirica, mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, yarrow, Achillea millefolium, horehound, Marubium vulgare, as well as Coluna vulgaris. And so these various combinations of herbs were added to make the ale more bitter and as a flavoring agent at the time, right? And somewhere around the 9th century, many of these monasteries were able to maintain monopolies on beer by controlling the license to produce Gruit. So it was becoming very commercially important, right? So this biochemistry of making fermented beverages is now being used commercially to make a popular to make money, right? So as we make money, well, we need some more regulation, right? Also around the 9th century, around 822 AD, this is when we start, this is when there's the first historical records of adding hops to beer. Now, what is hops? Hops is a climbing plant, so it's essentially a vine, and it can reach 19, 20 feet tall if you let it grow. It grows fairly well. And if you kind of look at the hops plant, that the hops is kind of the fruit of this plant is, you know, a small bright green little, it kind of looks like an acorn, right? If you peel this apart, you will see small yellow regions where the hops is the active ingredients of the hops is actually present. And so that's where your ingredients, that's where your bitter flavor is going to come from the hops. So before the 9th century, they really did not add hops to beer. They were more involved in Gruit ales. Now they're adding hops. Now we kind of have a little bit of a conflict, right? So there's kind of a shift. One of the major commodities of the Hanseatic League around 1159, that started that up until the 1700s. Well, one of the major commodities of the Hanseatic League that grew here was hops. And the Hanseatic League, of course, they knew that hops was, of course, the major flavoring agent responsible for the bitterness of beer, but it was also used as a preservative because the major ingredient in those hops is isohumulone. And isohumulone is a small chemical that also has antibacterial properties. And so what the hops were actually being added because now this enables the transport of beer over greater distances. You don't have to consume the beer locally. You can put it in barrels. You can transport it in ships and cargo. And then the hops would enable the beer to be transported a lot more easily without being without going bad or without spoiling. So that was very important. Also, of course, at this time, the Hanseatic League, because they're interested in making money, they realized people were making good money on Gruit as well. And so they were using their influence in taxation as well as regulation. Other people were using this regulation to resist the introduction of hops beer, right? So now we have a little bit of a conflict. And so hops beer made its first appearance in England around the 1300s, mostly due to resident foreigners, and especially the Hanseatic League who loved their hopped beer. And so then that hopped beer was ultimately known as beer, and the unhopped beer, the Gruit ales, were known as ale, right? So that's where we kind of get the two different terms, beer versus ale, right? And modern days, we now know there's two different terms, ale versus lager. And so what's the difference there? That determines the type of yeast that you're using for the fermentation process, right? Ale is using a higher temperature yeast. Lager is using a lower temperature yeast, so it needs a little bit more refrigeration or to be brewed in some of the cold storage areas in monasteries, right? So there's a couple interesting terms there. Of course, the British were also a little bit later, they started colonizing India. They were very interested in taking their beer to India as well. And of course, India is just a little bit further of a distance to travel and ship the beer. And so the British wanted to bring their beer with them. I don't blame them. So how did they do that? Well, they developed a recipe for India Pale Ales. And what this was they added a little bit more hops, a little bit more alcohol. That enabled the beer to have a little bit more preservative character to survive the long distance from England all the way to India, so that they could bring their Indian beers, that they could bring their British beers to India. So that's where the India Pale Ales arose out of, right? And of course, in the Middle Ages, of course, there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of commerce coming out. With that, people are making money. The governments want their fair share, so you're starting to get a lot of taxes. So you need a lot of regulation. Many commercial breweries were actually established around 1000 AD in what is now Belgium. Belgium is known for a lot of very fine Belgian ales, and so that kind of gave rise to its own variety. And so here around 1000 AD, this is where governments really began taking interest as a source of revenue, right? And of course, it was produced in specialized facilities in batches of a fixed size. That made it fairly easy to tax. You could tax it by the barrel. Taxes were collected on both the finished product as well as on individual ingredients, right? Regulation was also required because, well, the same yeast that's used in brewing is also used in making bread. So now there's two industries competing. So you've got the brewers and the bakers. Both are using heat, both are using ovens and furnaces. Because they're using furnaces, this creates a fire hazard, so you do need a little bit of safety regulations as well. And so a lot of those regulations began to arise at this time for these reasons as well, too, right? So now let's get up to the 15th century in Germany, and let's talk a little bit about the Reinheitsgebot, the German purity law. So the Reinheitsgebot was enacted. It was first introduced in Munich in 1487, and it was enacted and issued as a law by the Bavarian Dukes Wilhelm IV and Ludwig X on April 23rd, 1516. And this law has actually survived to modern day Europe. So what does the law say? The law basically limits the ingredients in beer to barley, water, and hops, three key ingredients, right? It was later expanded to add specific types of yeast and grains. Now, why did they do this? Because we all know that there's a lot of different varieties of beer. You can add adjuncts like rice. You can add fruits. You can add all sorts of things. I know several breweries like to add spices, and I think the ghost pepper. I know that if you really like a really hot beer, try some ghost pepper ale. That'll have a little bit of a bite to it. But that would go against the Reinheitsgebot, right? Beer can only have barley, water, and hops and specific types of yeast and very specific grains. So why did the Germans do this? Because they wanted to control the market for beer, and essentially this was the Middle Ages time of impacting taking some trademark, if you will. It can't be called beer without having these specific ingredients and basically coming right from Bavaria. We also see similar things, similar laws. Obviously, Anheuser-Busch ran into a little bit of a problem because the name Budweiser originated in the Czech Republic. And instead of America, but Budweiser, of course, is a very popular beer in the United States. So there's actually a law that prevents the name Budweiser from being sold in the Czech Republic. And there's similar laws that were attempted in the state of Kentucky regarding bourbon as well, but I'm not going to go into that right now for that. So there's a lot of interest in protecting your product and protecting your right to make the official version of beer. Now, in March 1987, the European Court of Justice actually declared the Reinheitsgebot to be protectionist, and so that was in violation of Article 30 of the Treaty of Rome. And so what that did was essentially nullify the German purity law throughout the European Union, although German brewers would adhere to their purity law locally, because obviously that could apply as a single state, not just the entire European Union. So yeah, elements of this German purity law have survived to modern days, right? So let's go across the ocean, and of course beer is also popular over here on this side of the pond in the United States. And of course, we've certainly got plenty of flavors of American beer. Of course, we've talked about Anheuser-Busch, Miller, Coors. Those are popular, as well as a lot of popular American microbreweries today. Well, beer in the United States went through a little bit of a hard time, especially in the early part of the 20th century with Prohibition. And so that the Prohibition is from about January 17th, 1920 to December 5th, 1933, when alcohol was prohibited by the U.S. Constitution from being sold or manufactured anywhere in the United States. Of course, we all know that during Prohibition, there was, in fact, plenty of alcohol being consumed and manufactured in speakeasies and in private. And, of course, the mob arose at this time as well, too. So we kind of had a little bit of a violence. So how did Prohibition start? Well, the origins of this go to the temperance movement at the end of the 19th century, as well as the religious movement known as Pietism. So there's a lot of concern that, we shouldn't be drinking or consuming alcohol. It's kind of it goes against the Bible. And there was also a lot of hostility to Germans in the aftermath of World War I, around 1917. And there was also a lot of Irish Catholic immigrants immigrating to the United States in the early 20th century. And of course, Irish Catholics, we all know, we certainly love our beer. Plus, the women's suffrage movement at this time led to a lot of politicians that were very interested in, looking for issues for newly enfranchised voters, mainly women. And so a lot of women were actually in favor of Prohibition at this time as well, too. So that kind of led to, it actually led to the Volstead Act in October 1919. This was introduced by Andrew Volstead, who is a Republican from the state of Minnesota. This actually enacted the laws of Prohibition, and then that was actually ratified into the Constitution. And so that lasted for at least about 10 years or so. I think actually about 12 years, if I'm correct, right? So let's just double check here. Prohibition, 1920 until 1933. So that's actually more like 13 years, right? And, well, during Prohibition, the government lost a whole lot of tax money, kind of like Prohibition on marijuana today. Think about all the tax money that states that are legalizing marijuana are getting. governments want a little bit of cut of that, right? Well, if you lose all that revenue, it's a lot of money, right? This was also right before the Great Depression, and that was one factor that led to the Great Depression because the government was not getting revenue. And of course, we had a lot of organized crime. The mafia was popular at this time. They did a lot of stuff. And it ultimately culminated to the Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 with all that gang violence. So in 1932, in the 1932 presidential election, Herbert Hoover was facing Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt, of course, campaigned to end Prohibition. He ended up winning. He actually got reelected about 4 times. And 1 month after Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1933, he signed a law that ended that led to the ratification of the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, ending Prohibition, which happened on December 5th, 1933. So Prohibition was a fairly difficult time, but ultimately it was ended. 2 years after Prohibition ended, of course, another organization was founded in Akron, Ohio, by Bill Wilson and Bob Smith. That is Alcoholics Anonymous. They were founded in 1935. And so that helped to deal with some of the issues of the problem with alcohol as a drug, as a CNS drug, and some of the adverse effects of consuming alcohol. Also in 1933, we also saw the return of advertising, mainly with, I think most evident is the Budweiser Clydesdales by Anheuser-Busch. They've been used and featured in many advertisements, especially those Super Bowl ads. They ultimately led to the Budweiser Frogs and other things in more recent history as well, too. So again, a lot of advertising has increased beer and made that more popular, right? Now, let's look at the contributions to science, because beer has caught the attention of chemists and biologists and a lot of scientists throughout history, even mathematicians, right? And I think Edward Buchner, who won the Nobel Prize in 1907, he ground up yeast with abrasives and squeezed fluid through a cloth, and then he added sugar and CO2, and ethanol were produced from that sugar, right? So this is kind of an evidence that yeast was actually undergoing fermentation, right? So that was kind of interesting as well. So beer and brewing have played a significant role in scientific advancements, especially in chemistry, biology, microbiology, as well as statistics even, right? So how did brewing lead to these developments? Let's go back to the development of the thermometer by Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit in the early 18th century. And so the thermometer was developed as a means of measuring temperature control, and he developed the Fahrenheit scale. And then about 30 years later, in the 1760s, James Baverstock was one of the first brewers to apply those thermometers to improve the consistency of fermentation in brewing. And so why is this important? Because temperature control is crucial to consistency and making a consistent product. This is because the enzymes that break down starches in the barley, they have an optimum activity, an optimum temperature when they are active at any given time, right? And if the temperature is off by just a few degrees, that beer, you're going to get a different flavor because the enzyme is not producing the most product that it possibly can. So that's going to affect the amount of fermentable sugars and therefore affect the amount of alcohol and affect the amount of sugars that are actually in your final product, right? So what Boverstock did in the 1760s, this was very important to drive the standardization of modern thermometric development. And that's critical not just for the fermentation industry, but science and industry in general, right? The second thing is actually the hydrometer, right? So what's a hydrometer? We know what a thermometer is. A hydrometer actually measures specific gravity, right? So it's looking at the specific gravity of one substance versus another. And if you have a mixture, then you're going to be able to kind of determine how much of each substance is in that mixture, right? The hydrometer was not developed by brewers. It actually dates back to the ancient Greek days of Archimedes. But the hydrometer, the first use of the hydrometer in brewing goes back to 1770 with John Richardson, and he actually used the hydrometer to measure the sugar content of wort before and after fermentation, and this enables us to predict quite accurately the alcohol content of beer to optimize brewing efficiency, right? And now a hydrometer is an essential tool in chemistry and medicine, even in analyzing the concentration of things like sugar and other contents of urine. So, for example, urinalysis. So we use this very commonly, not just to make beverages, but also to cure disease and to diagnose things as well too. Yeast. A lot of attention has been made towards the development of yeast, and specifically we're interested in Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which we've been using for thousands of years to brew. A lot of development with this goes back to the 19th century. Before this, we didn't know a whole lot about yeast. We just knew that, hey, if we have this yeast here, we add this to our sugars, it's going to make alcohol and CO2. We make a nice beverage from it. Along comes the 19th century, and around 1857, Louis Pasteur comes along, and he's actually studying spoilage in beer. And he discovered at this time that yeast is actually a microorganism. Before, we didn't know what yeast was. We just kind of knew it was some kind of powder that you added to the beer to cause fermentation. So that was kind of an important development. And Louis Pasteur actually laid the foundation of this development throughout the industry with microbiology, the development of pasteurization. This laid a lot of the basics we know today with germ theory. And so this revolutionized not only medicine, but also food safety. So this is a very important work and important development. Also in the late 1800s, another scientist, Emil Christian Hansen, working at the Carlsberg Brewery in Denmark, he developed a technique called pure yeast culturing, and this allows for very consistent beer production. And now that we can culture yeast, we can culture other cells, and this leads to the cultivation of not just yeast, but also things like E. coli and other cells in modern biotechnology that even today is used very widely in the purification and growing proteins, and a lot of studies for cancer research, for AIDS, for viruses, for all sorts of developments, right? So we've learned a lot from fermentation in this area. Proteins. Now, beer is really mainly carbohydrates and water. There can be some protein in beer. A lot of this protein is what we call, involved in haze. It kind of leads to the chill haze, And what we're talking about here is the clarity of beer. And so beer clarity is affected by protein polyphenol interactions, right? And so these interactions lead to that haze. And early brewers were very interested in investigating these interactions. And this led to a lot of advances in protein chemistry. For example, in 1883, scientist Keldal developed a technique called nitrogen analysis, and this is also developed in Denmark at Carlsberg Brewery. This is a technique used to measure the protein content in that beer, and this is now a relatively standard technique throughout the food science and biochemistry industry. So this is very widely used today. I can't really not talk about the pH scale in terms of beer because this is one of the more widely known parts of fermentation and developments. So the pH scale was developed in the early 20th century by Sorensen. That's right. I think I got the name right. Also working at the Carlsberg laboratory, the Carlsberg Brewery. And so we all know this pH scale from 0 to 14. And that pH scale, pH 7 is perfectly neutral, and anything less than 7 is acidic. Greater than 7 is basic. This is very important in blood chemistry. This tells us if we're acidotic or alkalotic. It's widely used throughout biochemistry and the field of chemistry in general. You will not get a degree in chemistry without knowledge of pH in some way, shape, or form. And so what does this have to do with fermentation? Well, the pH of mash and wort has a great effect on enzyme activity as well as on its ability, the wort's ability to be fermented, and it has a big impact on flavor. In fact, the pH of any food will have an impact on flavor as well. If you've ever had really acidic citrus fruits, that also has an impact on flavor. And so brewers were fairly early adopters of methods in pH measurement, and this contributed to the refinement of the pH scale and the development of better pH meters as well, such as the glass electrode pH meter, in addition, to measure pH. So now it's very widely used in medicine and chemistry, and even in environmental science when we study the effects of pH in the environment, for example, in soil and groundwater, for example. So that's also very important. Lastly, statistics also traces some of its development to the brewing industry. And let's go to Ireland, and in Dublin, there's a very famous brewery called the Guinness Brewery, founded by Sir Arthur Guinness. And Guinness is, of course, a very widely known stout, excellent beer, very dark beer, but probably one of the premier products out of Ireland. Well, the Guinness Brewery, they had a statistician that was employed, William Seeley Gossett, and in 1908, he developed the student's t-test, which was used to analyze very small sample sizes and assess their statistical significance. So if you take the mean, two different means of two different samples, the t-test is a way to look at the statistical significance of both of those statistical averages. And Guinness used this as a way to ensure quality control with very limited data. And now today, Gossett's work is used as one of the most fundamental statistical tools in scientific research, even in medicine, and also economics as well, because statistics is very important in the science of economics also. So here we've kind of demonstrated how brewing has influenced multiple scientific disciplines. This drives innovations in temperature control, analytical chemistry, microbiology, statistics, all throughout the cultivation. We've led our desire to create a better beer has led to discoveries that now impact medicine, food science, even engineering. So this has been, fermentation's a very important process that humans have engaged in for thousands of years. And today it's a pretty big industry, and it's driven development across science. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you're enjoying listening to many of the topics I'm talking about in Biochemistry Unfolded, from atoms to algorithms. If you like this, go ahead and leave a comment down below, and hit the like button. And if you want to stay updated on future episodes, go ahead and subscribe to this channel, and that definitely tells me, hey, people are listening to this stuff, and that's pretty important. So until then, cheers, and I will see you at the pub, and we will enjoy a nice frosty beverage while we're talking about the future of science. Thank you for watching Biochemistry Unfolded, from atoms to algorithms. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to this channel, and we will keep you informed of future episodes. Thank you.